Hello, Butler Family Reunion. My name's Steve Swenson, and I live in Osage, Iowa. Back in 1984, I was a 16-year-old junior in Humboldt, Iowa. Kenny and Lois Dale were neighbors of mine. At the time, I was taking a class in high school, a speech class, and one of the assignments we'd been given was to write a speech about a hero. At the time, a lot of people wrote speeches about their parents. There were a couple people that wrote speeches about famous people throughout history. But I had always had an interest in World War II, and Kenny, being a World War II veteran, I knew something about his background and his experience, but I'd never really got into a deep dive or in detail with him about that. So I thought about, who I would want to write that article about or write that speech about, and Kenny was the one that came to my mind because A, I knew where to find him. He was in my backyard. B, he was a really good friend of both my parents, and C, I thought he probably would be willing to talk to me about it. So as I recall, I asked my dad if he thought that would be okay, and he said, sure, why not? So I called Kenny and Lois and invited them to come over to our house for dinner one evening at Mom and Dad's suggestion. And when we were done having dinner, I interviewed Kenny about his experiences in World War II. Based on that interview, I wrote up my speech that I gave to class at that point in time. Um, I don't remember a whole lot about it other than, again, I was a 16-year-old junior and I thought I just need to do something to get this speech done with. So Dean, I guess, is going to read that to you folks. And so I hope you enjoy it. I hadn't read it in 40 years. It had been a long time since then. So just remember, I was a 16-year-old junior when I wrote this, and I never thought that anybody else would ever see it again. So with that being said, enjoy both the speech and the rest of your reunion. Take care. Bye-bye.
War experiences. You've been flying for the last 2 hours. You've grown so accustomed to the drone of the engines that you don't even notice them. As you come closer to the target, you get tense and scared. You start to pray that you'll make it through another one. When you start the bomb run, little black clouds of flak dot the sky around your plane. Over the intercom, you hear the pilot warn your crew to watch for fighters. Your eyes strain towards the sun, then you see them, their wings winking as they send a stream of lead towards a bomber to your right. You can see a pattern of holes form along the wing of the plane. All of a sudden, the wing is engulfed in fire. The plane noses over and dives towards the ground. One of your best friends is on that plane. You look for parachutes, but there are none. You wonder if you're next. This scene happened every day during the Second World War. At the height of the bomber offensive in Europe, you had only a 30% chance of surviving your tour of duty and being sent home. I interviewed one man who was in that bomber offensive, but because he wishes to remain anonymous, I'll call him Sergeant X. Sergeant X was 21 when he was drafted in December of 1942, and although he was scared, he wanted to go because he felt it was his duty. He started out at basic training, 1 month of push-ups and marching. After basic, the men were split up and went to different schools according to what they were chosen to do. There was no chance to choose what you wanted to do, and volunteering seldom did any good. Sergeant X was sent to radio school at Scott Field in Bellevue, Illinois. There he learned to operate a radio and the codes that went along with it. After radio school, he was sent to armament school in Denver, Colorado. There they learned how bombs and machine guns worked and how to operate them. Some days they would take their guns completely apart and put them back together again for 5 hours straight, eventually getting good enough to do it blindfolded. It was here that Sergeant X also got his first taste of kitchen duty. For 12 hours at a time, they would be on kitchen duty. To prepare breakfast, the men would crack dozens of eggs and dump them in a 15-gallon bucket. Then the cooks would mix them up and make scrambled eggs. Occasionally a piece of shell or blood spot would get in, but it didn't matter. The mess sergeant told them to scramble the eggs anyway. After armament school came gunnery school in Kingman, Arizona. Here they learned to shoot. There were several ways they trained. One was to shoot at a white flag that was attached to a motorized handcar which ran in circles on a railroad track. Other ways were by shooting on the firing range and by shooting skeet, which taught them how to lead. They would also get in planes and fire at a white sheet being towed behind another plane. Occasionally, the gunners would miss their mark and hit the tow plane. After 2 months of gunnery training, they went to Shreveport, Louisiana, where they received their crew assignments. For 5 months, the crews practiced night flying, skip bombing, and flying in formation. Even practicing was hazardous. In one instance, 18 crewmen were killed when they flew into bad weather. They tried to get under it and crashed into some mountains. From Shreveport, they traveled to Savannah, Georgia, where they got some lectures and received a new plane. From there, it was over to Europe. After making several stops along the way, the group arrived in Nuts Corner, Ireland. Here they received one last bit of instruction. They had a 15-minute class in parachute jumping, which was the only class on jumping they ever had. The only thing they learned was that this was something you did right the first time. By now it was September of 1944, and the Allies had invaded France. Sergeant X's group was assigned to airstrip AB in Bayeux, France. There they started their missions. Preparation for a mission usually started at 3 in the morning. Because of the 30 to 40 below temperatures they were flying in, they wore as much clothing as they could find. After getting dressed, they would have a breakfast of cold oatmeal in the bombed-out hangar, which was the group's mess hall. Then the crews would go to the briefing room where they would be told the target of the day. The weatherman would tell them what kind of weather to expect, and the intelligence man would give them a report of the amount of flak and number of fighters to expect. Finally, the men would pick up their parachutes and be taken out to their planes. Before getting the signal to take off, they would inspect the plane and spin the propellers to check the engines and get the oil through them. When the signal was given, the crew would get in their planes, taxi, and take off at the rate of about 1 every 5 seconds. The targets of Sergeant X's group were mostly bridges, railroad yards, and other targets that would create confusion for enemy troops. After the mission, which usually lasted 4.5 to 5 hours, the crews would go to the debriefing room where the doctor would give everyone a glass of liquor to calm their nerves. Then the intelligence officers would ask if they had seen anything unusual, either in the air or on the ground. The mental strain on an airman was enormous. You were always scared, and as you neared enemy territory, you began to pray a lot. Some men cracked, for instance. After taking off on a mission, one guy said he couldn't take it anymore, grabbed his parachute, and jumped out of the plane. He was later captured and court-martialed. The living conditions were not the greatest. The food consisted mainly of oatmeal and canned hash. There was no fresh food at all, so the airmen would, on occasion, steal boxes of rations and trade them to the French for fresh eggs and potatoes. They lived in tents year-round with wood stoves for heating, but there was wood only about half the time, so the rest of the time they slept with as many clothes as they could find. The horrors of war tend to leave a lasting impression in your mind, and Sergeant X had several missions that stuck out in his mind. For instance, one time he was waving to the top turret gunner of a plane down below him when all of a sudden it disappeared. It had received a direct hit from a flak shell. Another mission he remembers was the first time he saw a German jet. The crews had been warned about the jet but never saw one until one mission when a jet flew across their formation. It was going so fast the gunners couldn't even track it with their guns. Luckily for the crews, the jet never attacked. Then there were the missions where they came close to death. One time the group was returning home on a mission when they ran into a fog bank so thick they couldn't even see the tips of their wings. Out of the 36 planes in the group, 12 crashed into the ground trying to get below it. On another mission, after dropping their bombs, they had to dive from 6,000 to 1,000 feet in order to avoid a collision with another bomber above them. They flew even lower than that on some missions. For example, on some strafing missions, they flew so low they could see in the second-story windows of buildings. On March 2, 1945, the war came to an end for Sergeant X. His group was attacking a railroad yard in Frankfurt, Germany, when they were attacked by a fighter and received 3 flak hits, 2 in the left wing and 1 in the tail. The hits to the wing knocked out the engine and tore away the aileron, while the hit in the tail wounded Sergeant X and damaged the rudder. After he was hit, Sergeant X noticed blood but couldn't feel any pain. He realized his left arm was injured when he tried pulling himself to the front of the plane and couldn't. Using his right arm, he pulled himself back to the waist gunner, who told the rest of the crew. In the meantime, the plane was losing altitude and the pilot decided everyone should bail out. They were going to tie the ripcord of Sergeant X's parachute to the plane and push him out, but when they went back to get his chute, it was full of holes. Then the co-pilot said that he and Sergeant X could go down on the same chute, but the crew decided that wouldn't work. Finally, the pilot told everyone to bail out except Sergeant X and him. The rest of the crew wouldn't leave, though, so they decided to crash land. They had been flying over forests the whole time and were going to crash into the trees when they saw an advanced fighter base under construction and crash landed there. A medical team at the base gave him first aid and sent him to a hospital in Verdun, France. From Verdun, he went to a hospital in Paris, and after a stay there, he was sent back to the States on a hospital plane. After he arrived in New York, Sergeant X was told he could have anything he wanted to eat. The first thing he had was bacon and eggs. Germany, Japan, and Italy went to war to enslave other nations. The U.S. and our allies were forced into war to preserve our liberty from their tyranny. Without men like Sergeant X, Kenny, that liberty could not have been preserved. Without men who were willing to risk and in some cases lose their lives, our country and all the freedom that we have would be gone. The next time you see our flag, don't think of it as 50 states and 13 colonies, but as the 12,364,000 men that served in our armed forces so that you could see those stars and stripes instead of a swastika.